just go ahead and I'll just go ahead and get started. Let me get my timer so that I keep on time. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. I love the opportunity to share about the Laguna de Santa Rosa and about the work that we do at the Laguna de Santa Rosa Foundation. I just want to orient you a little bit to where the Laguna de Santa Rosa is relative to Santa Rosa. So the watershed, 250 square mile watershed for the Laguna de Santa Rosa encompasses all of Cotati, Rohnert Park, Santa Rosa, and Windsor, and most of Sebastopol. So the brown line on the map on the left represents that watershed, and all of the creeks that come from Hood Mountain and up in the Mayacamas and Sonoma Mountain run westward into the Laguna de Santa Rosa, which is a 22-mile channel starting in Cotati, and it joins the Russian River near Forestville. And this blue star will help orient where things are on most of the maps that I've included today. And on the right-hand side, I just want to point out this is where our Laguna Environmental Center is located along Occidental Road, just east of the Laguna Channel and northeast of Sebastopol. First, I also want to acknowledge the original peoples, the Coast Miwok and the Southern Pomo. We are, again, located within their ancestral territory, and today many of the people that are a part of these ancestral families are members of the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria. And it's really is the crossroads, as you can see up in the mountains to the east and northeast are the Wapo people and the Kashaya Pomo on the coast. And many people still live in Sonoma County today. The map on the top right is from the late 1800s. It was an archaeologist that was doing work in the area. And it represents both permanent and seasonal villages along the Laguna de Santa Rosa, as well as the Russian River, and it just attests to the rich diversity of fish and wildlife and plants that supported one of the highest densities of Native Americans at the time. A little bit more about the watershed itself. So in the map on your left, the bottom right is the Laguna de Santa Rosa watershed. That was the first map I showed, and we're actually a sub-watershed to the Russian River. So it's also considered the largest watershed in the amount of water that runs through the creeks and streams into the Laguna and then the Russian River. And just like this definition by John Wesley Powell about a watershed, in that it's really talks about human settling. It's an area of land bounded hydraulic system within which all living things are inextricably linked by their common watercourse, and where, as humans settled, simple logic demanded that they become part of a community. And of course, that just reiterates what I was talking about with the Native Americans. They located a lot of their village sites along rivers and creeks because water was so integral to their survival. And of course, along waters and creeks, we find a lot of good places for other humans to settle, as we'll learn a little bit about the history. A bit about the geology and how the Laguna formed. If you're familiar with the fault lines, the Sebastopol fault that runs kind of north-south along the Gold Ridge area near Sebastopol. And the Laguna originally was considered part of created by that fault system. So where things settled out and across the Santa Rosa Plain, it is the lowest point in the geography here in Sonoma County. And so along this fault line, it created all these lakes and ponds, and hence it was called the Laguna, Spanish for Lake, de Santa Rosa. This also shows the different formations, geological formations, and how important the Santa Rosa Plain is for groundwater systems and moving groundwater and surface water off of the mountains and into our subsoils. Today, the main part of the Laguna de Santa Rosa looks like this in many places. In the bottom left, that's up in the higher parts of Marquess Creek. And then down on the floodplain, we get the channel in its various forms. This middle section is kind of a normal winter pre-flooding, where we have a channel of the Laguna crosses Occidental Road. And this is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Wildlife Reserve. And then in other times of the winter, such as the top right, you'll get a bit more of the flooding within that floodplain. And the bottom right, if you're familiar with the bridge crossing near in Sebastopol, that's what the Laguna looks like at that time. And it also has a lot of different freshwater wetlands associated, both along the channel and adjacent to the Laguna. Another interesting geological formation that is important to us at the foundation are what we call vernal pools. So the map on the left shows the topography. The darker colors are the Mayacamas and Sonoma Mountain. And then you can see the Laguna de Santa Rosa just along the western edge here, and all the streams that come across. The Santa Rosa Plain is the flat area where most of the development is and the agricultural interests. And it's a relatively flat plain, and it's underlain by hard pan or clay pan. And it's dotted by vernal pools. You often don't see them most of the time of the year. They're very subtle depressions, but especially this spring, after all the rains we had, a lot of the pastures that still exist, you'll see beautiful sets of flowers that I'll talk about a little bit later. They're important for pollinators. And there are a number of larger vernal pools, some that have been protected in preserves that support endangered species such as the California tiger salamander. So I want to go through some of the issues that are facing the Laguna de Santa Rosa, both historically and today. Of course, there's been a lot of land use changes, issues around flood control and sediment that is built up in the Laguna, impacting water quality, as well as invasive plant species and, of course, climate change. So historically, after the first settlers being the indigenous people, the Spanish and Mexican came in and established, their rancheros, and we know a lot about what the Laguna was like during that time because of these historic maps that were created when the Spaniards and the missionaries and Mexicans settled these areas. And this is just a map of some of the land grants. By the turn of the 20th century, the 1900s, the Laguna was really important as a recreation area. So we had a lot of folks coming up on the railroad from San Francisco to hunt and to fish. And just love the picture up in the top left of the ladies in their hats and their umbrellas. They were out on what was known as Lake Honive, which is located near Sebastopol. Today, it's not as distinguished as a lake. It's because the Laguna is shallower, and that's something I'll talk about a little bit about how it's changed over time. But it was really important that then as the communities grew, both Sebastopol and Santa Rosa, which is the top right, that's Santa Rosa Creek, running through the early development of Santa Rosa, looking across the Santa Rosa Plain to the west. And with that development came at the time, the attitude of the wetlands being places where you put your waste and your trash. And so it was sometime in the mid 1900s that the Laguna de Santa Rosa itself was considered highly polluted. And at one point, the California Department of Fish and Game declared it to be devoid of life. There were a lot of issues with the water quality, and so there were fish kills. And part of that was because the apple canneries would dump their pulp into the Laguna de Santa Rosa, as well as their other wastewater, human wastewater, until the 1960s and 70s, when more modern techniques of wastewater treatment came into play. And these maps just show, again, the population, of course, post-World War II. And after the 1960s, 70s, the population just boomed. And the pattern here is showing The pink is the developed areas, so residential, commercial, industrial, and how they've expanded over time. The green is non-irrigated agriculture, so that's primarily your pastures and grazing for cattle. And you can see over time that the green converted, as well as orchards, converted mostly to vineyards. The irrigated agriculture are primarily the vineyards that are more prevalent today. So what that's led to is a lot of changes within the area, as you all well know, in particular along the floodplain of the Laguna de Santa Rosa, so the channel that runs from Cotati to Forestville, where it enters the Russian River. Within that with so-called 100-year floodplain, we know a lot, again, about what the historical habitat types were based on those old maps from the Spanish missionaries, and then later in the centuries, the aerial photography. And we were able to map out what the historical habitats look like on the left map. And today you can see it's been highly converted. There's still quite a bit of the oak savanna vernal pool complex, the orange, which is mostly open pasture and sometimes open space protected by state and regional governments. And then a lot of it, the red, has been developed over into primarily urban and residential. And of course, how wetlands work, they're really important for a number of reasons. They hold water during floods, they release it slowly. It goes into the groundwater, and the plants themselves actually are a natural filter of pollutants, primarily low levels of pollutants like nitrogen and phosphorus. And of course, it provides important wildlife habitat, and I'll highlight a few of these things and how they've changed over time. So these maps show what historically how the water would flow from the east off the Mayacamas and Sonoma Mountain across the Santa Rosa Plain and into the Laguna de Santa Rosa, which is the blue part. And so you can see that there was a lot of groundwater recharge throughout the region. So Santa Rosa is right about here in the middle of the watershed. And the creeks would primarily run, so there's Marquess Creek, is this larger creek here, and Santa Rosa Creek. Once they hit the flat floodplain, they would spread out and slowly move westward into the Laguna de Santa Rosa. Today, what we have, because of flood control, is that a lot of the creeks run fast across the Santa Rosa Plain and into the Laguna itself. So that's really changed the hydrology in many ways. An example of this is showing in blue kind of the original creeks, so like Santa Rosa Creek coming west from Santa Rosa, a lot of these meandering channels like you would expect in these creeks. And they were subsequently in the 40s and 50s, they were straightened. So the modern channel shows a lot of straight channels that run across the Santa Rosa Plain. On the right, you can see in the late 1800s, Santa Rosa Creek was meandering. Even in 1942, it was still a meandering stream across the Santa Rosa Plain and came into the Laguna Channel. But today, it's pretty much been straightened and channelized as a straight shot into the Laguna. And what this affects, again, is that all the water basically rushes off the mountains and across the plain and into the Laguna, intended to control flooding in these populated areas. And this is an example of the upper Copeland Creek up in the upper watershed on Sonoma Mountain. You get a lot of these natural erosional hillsides. This is a person here in the red, so you can get a sense of scale. And as it flows out of the mountains, a lot of the heavier rock and pebbles fall out, but the fine sediment continues on down to the Laguna de Santa Rosa, especially in high floods, and ends up filling the Laguna de Santa Rosa with this sediment. Another issue is with all of the water coming out of the mountains and crossing through urban areas and across the agricultural lands into the Laguna. is both stormwater and wastewater. But today, much of that is treated at the Santa Rosa, the Laguna Treatment Center. And a lot of the water then is also recycled through irrigation on these farms that are shown in purple. Some of these are owned by the city of Santa Rosa, and some are private pasture and dairy farms where they pay to receive treated wastewater that they can use for irrigation. And a majority of the treated wastewater now goes up to the geysers facility and used in their steam system to generate energy. Another look at how this affects the sediment. Again, a similar picture of the Laguna de Santa Rosa watershed. A lot of the sediment coming out of the mountains would form along the Santa Rosa plain and just kind of helped create that plain. And today, all that sediment now goes directly into the Laguna de Santa Rosa. And what that's done is it's made the laguna shallower, and that has impacts on water quality and the physical nature of the laguna and how it holds and moves water. So how that's managed today, primarily by Sonoma Water Agency. They manage a number of these creeks. They originally were the ones that did the flood control and did the straightening, but they're also a partner now in putting back vegetation on a lot of these different creek channels. But it also requires removing of that sediment. So on the right-hand side, you can see an example of how much sediment fills in and then plants grow. And you just have this little trickle of water here on the right. They have to go in and dig out that sediment to restore the ability of these channels to move water through the urban areas. So another consequence of this is the cycle of how the water quality is managed by wetlands. As I mentioned earlier, this graphic on the top right shows how wetland plants actually filter out nitrogen and also they hold phosphorus in those plant communities. But with the issues around wastewater treatment and runoff from urban areas and from our agricultural lands, and a lot of the agricultural practices use nitrogen and phosphorus as a fertilizer. So that helps plants grow. And what it does is it creates this almost a negative cycle within our natural wetlands, that the high nutrient levels that are both in the water and in the sediment allow invasive species such as Ludwigia, which is also called the water primrose, become established. So they become these floating mats of vegetation, which also then, as they decompose, and because the sediment creates the more shallower and warm water conditions, this leads to low dissolved oxygen, which can kill fish and other aquatic life. And then this just makes it a continuous cycle. That is, the low dissolved oxygens make the phosphorus more soluble, and the cycle continues. And early on, the Laguna Foundation and partners tried to do physical removal of the Ludwigia, but it just comes right back. And so our focus right now is actually restoring the laguna by removing sediment, making deeper channels so that we have colder water that flows more regularly, so that the conditions aren't there for invasive species like Ludwigia to become established. So the bird's eye view of what the laguna is today, it looks very different depending on where you are. This bottom left shows Katati, and it's pretty much entirely developed in residential areas. And so the laguna headwaters, which started in a pasture just near Railroad Avenue, now runs through Katati in a flood control channel. The upper left is around where the laguna enters the Russian River, so it's surrounded by agricultural lands. And then upper right is still pretty pristine up in the Mayacamas Mountains at Marquess Creek. And then near the east or western edge of Santa Rosa, you can see how Piner Creek and Santa Rosa Creek come in. And it's still really important as a flood basin, of course. If you have seen the pictures from this last winter, also in June, you can see this is an area in Sebastopol looking east towards Taylor Mountain and Mayacamas Mountains, and you can see the important role that this floodplain provides for holding floodwaters. It's also critically important as a migratory stopover for a number of bird species, and we have year-round residents such as the red-tailed hawk, and we have nesting bald eagles, and river otters have returned, which is a sign that the water is improving. And it's still very important for Native Americans for harvesting different plants that are important to them. Some areas are open to waterfowl hunting, and it's great for recreation, from wildlife observation to kayaking in the wintertime to hiking. It was also designated a wetland of international importance under the Convention on Wetlands. This is the only international convention among hundreds of countries that recognize the importance of wetlands as an ecosystem. And a number of properties, publicly owned properties and some private properties, joined together to get this designation and recognition as a wetland of international importance in 2011. And this just shows the variety of designations throughout the world. So the restoration, the Laguna de Santa Rosa Foundation itself, we were established in 1989 by a diverse group of volunteers that wanted to restore the Laguna de Santa Rosa. And our mission today is to restore and conserve the Laguna de Santa Rosa and to to inspire public appreciation. We are fueled by a team of about 15 permanent employees. We have a board of directors and a passionate community of volunteers that help us in a number of ways. We're supported by individual contributions and grants and contracts. And we do restoration, conservation, and education primarily. I'll highlight some of those. Also, just explanation, most people are familiar with the Laguna de Santa Rosa because of the Laguna de Santa Rosa regional trail that runs from Highway 12 up to Occidental Road. And that is actually run by the regional parks, and it runs through a number of the city-owned farms. And also there's City of Sebastopol Wetland Preserve. The Laguna de Santa Rosa Foundation itself, we're located on a City of Santa Rosa farm, stone farm, up at the top left. And we do have an 8-acre parcel called the Laguna Uplands Preserve in Sebastopol. But we primarily work on other people's properties, both public and private lands. And our restoration program, just keeping an eye on the time, there's a number of reasons why restoring wetlands are important for climate change by storing carbon, replenishing and filtering our water supply, helping with biodiversity for efficient wildlife and plants. And it's good for ecotourism and improving livelihoods. So, it's important for the economy and the well-being of Sonoma County residents. The Laguna Foundation started out with doing restoration in what we call the middle reach of the Laguna here around Sebastopol. And then we've now expanded to sites throughout the watershed, as far up as Hood Mountain and along the Laguna Channel and many creeks. But primarily what we do is we go in to widen the riparian corridors along these creeks and improve the native plants. So we remove large, clusters of the invasive Himalayan blackberry that takes over everything, and we replace it with the native forbs and grasses under the understory. And we also go in and plant native oaks and willows and different species of trees. This is an example of some of the creek restoration that we do. We do designs where we create a wider riparian area along the creek that might have been grazed or plowed right up to the edge of the creeks. And so we go in and we work with our partners on these designs. We go in and we start to plant native species and restore that canopy of riparian forest. Something we're doing with our partners at Sonoma Water and with funding from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife is looking at the entire floodplain of the Laguna de Santa Rosa and looking for opportunities for restoration. And that's what this map on the right is. So these are different project areas where we'll start doing some larger scale restoration. And the idea is to deepen the channel by removing sediment, putting in more plants for wildlife, providing shade, cooling the water, and restoring it where, to the extent that we can, where it is still within open space, which is actually an advantage here in Sonoma County, that we do have so much open space, that we have these opportunities. Our conservation program is focused on the vernal pools. And again, there's 3 endangered plant species that we focus on in our native plant nursery. That's the Sebastopol meadowfoam, Burke's goldfield, and Sonoma sunshine. And we help manage these properties through grazing and raking and restoring the native plant assemblage in these vernal pools. Some of the vernal pools also support the endangered California tiger salamander. And this is a climate change adaptation project that we're working on with a grant from the California State Coastal Conservancy. We've selected 5 sites that we work on with our partners, including one over in Sonoma Valley at the Sonoma Valley Regional Park, where we're growing the plants in our nursery and going and reseeding these sites and using prescribed fire and grazing in order to help maintain the resiliency of these vernal pools, especially during years of drought. And what the issue is that the invasive grasses take over, and if you don't get rid of them because there's no more native grazers, then it overwhelms the native plants. And so that's why we go in and we physically remove the thatch, either through raking or grazing or prescribed fire. And then during the winter, when the rains come and fill the pools, then the native plants have an opportunity to survive. Our education program falls under our mission statement of inspiring public appreciation. And we have the Laguna Environmental Center, where we have a lot of our workshops and community events. We have a native plant garden, demonstration garden, and a nursery that we work in partnership with the California Native Plant Society. We have an in-school program called Learning Laguna that's 25 plus years with funding from the Ag and Open Space District. And our docents go into the schools, 3rd and 4th grade. They teach them about wetlands and watershed ecology, and then they come out for a field trip at the Laguna. And this has been a really fantastic program. It's free to the schools and to the families, and we also pay for bus transportation. We also have a summer day camp, and we've expanded to 4 sessions this year called Camp Thule, where the kids literally spend the entire day outside. They come to the Laguna Environmental Center, but they spend outside on the Laguna every day. And we've expanded this program for 6 to 9-year-olds. We now have a session for 10 to 12-year-olds. And we have a new program that's what we call counselors in training for those kids that are 13 to 16 years old. And then we have a paid program through a new fund called Leap into Nature. And LEAP stands for Laguna Environmental Allies Program. And it's a way for us to actually pay our youth to be counselors and naturalists instead of them having to get a summer job, so we can hire more diverse youth to partner with us on working with the kids at these camps. And then we have a whole variety of other education programs for adults and for families. We do Laguna Stewardship Days, where we're either cleaning up trash or planting native plants. The one in the middle is a new oak tree that's been planted. And we also host volunteer days at our native plant garden. And then give a lot of workshops that I think there'll be a link in the chat, that anything from basket weaving to learning about bird songs and bird colors. And we also host nature-themed art shows in our facility. And we're just about to leap into our strategic planning process and looking forward to the future for the Laguna de Santa Rosa, and welcome you to join us in whichever way you're interested. We have A lot of our webinars are recorded, and on our YouTube channel, we have a monthly e-news that you can sign up with on our website, and lots of ways to support our work and to participate in our work. I think I got through that with 15 seconds to spare, so I'm going to stop sharing so I can